Hey there everyone, welcome back to the channel. Last video में we talked about top 10 JavaScript interview questions and the response on the video was amazing, especially the shots that I posted. So इस वीडियो में हम लोग बात करने वाले हैं top 10 React interview questions के बारे में. So I've given a lot of interviews और मैंने काफ़ी सारे interviews लिए भी हैं. Based on my experience, these are the set of interview questions that I've put together. These are primarily focused towards beginners. Now, React continues to dominate the front-end space and rightly so. But this also means that the interview process for React is becoming competitive day by day. So let's jump right into these questions and understand them carefully so that you can crack your next front-end interview. Now, just like the previous video, in today's video as well, we'll talk about each and every question into three different segments. The first segment will be understanding the problem, then we'll be looking into the solution, and then the approach that you should take during an interview. First up, we have what is virtual DOM and why is it important? So virtual DOM is a lightweight representation of the actual DOM. That's it. So let's take an analogy for understanding this better. Just like an architect has a blueprint of the entire building, and before making changes to the actual building, you make changes to the blueprint so that it is easy for you to undo these changes. Same is the case with virtual DOM and real DOM. Before making the changes to the real DOM, React makes changes to the virtual DOM whenever a state updates and then compares using the diffing algorithm if there are any changes between the virtual DOM and the real DOM. After the comparison, it only updates the real DOM once it notices any changes to the virtual DOM. So why the concept of virtual DOM? Direct DOM manipulation is inefficient and slow. Now, virtual DOM क्या करता है? एक मिडिल लेयर की तरह काम करता है. बेसिकली जो भी आपके ऑपरेशंस हैं जो आपको करने हैं रियल डॉम पे, रिएक्ट पहले वो चेंजेस वर्चुअल डॉम पे करता है एंड देन इट रिफ्लेक्ट्स दोस चेंजेस टू द रियल डॉम. सो हाउ कैन यू एक्चुअली डिस्क्राइब दिस ड्यूरिंग एन इंटरव्यू? Pause this video and understand this paragraph clearly. What are the points that you should mention during an interview? Now let's move on to the next question, which is explain the component lifecycle in React and how hooks have changed it completely. So in class components, this lifecycle consists of three major methods exposed by React: component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. These methods allows us users or us coders to write code that should execute within the specific phases of a component lifecycle. But how the hooks have changed it completely is that only the useEffect hook has combined all of these three methods into a single one. You can use useEffect for all these three cases. So that is what it is written over here, that instead of spreading the lifecycle logic across different methods, hooks consolidate them into one place. UseEffect essentially combines all the three methods in class components, which are component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount, depending on how you configure its dependency array. So now, taking hooks into consideration, how has the component lifecycle changed? Let's see. UseEffect with an empty dependency array behaves like component did mount. With dependencies, it runs on mount and behaves like component did update. And the cleanup function of useEffect behaves like component will unmount. Pause the video to understand how you can answer this question better during an interview. Now let's move on to the next question, which is what is the difference between state and props? Now many of you might already know this answer, लेकिन फिर भी we can talk about this. तो हम state कब use करते हैं? Whenever we want to manage some data internally within the component, that is when we use state. State का simple एक reason है जिसके लिए आप उसे use करोगे, for component re-rendering. अगर आपको कोई भी component re-render करना है, so you add that data or that particular field to the use state, and then using that you can re-render that component. Props basically data sharing के लिए काम आते हैं. When you want to send some data from the parent component to the child component, you use props. Now props cannot be directly manipulated or changed by the child component unless you pass explicitly a handler to the child component. तो key difference क्या है? State is managed within the components while props are passed from outside. Simple. State can be changed directly by the component, whereas props cannot be modified directly by the component. Now, how you can answer this question during an interview? Pause this video, understand this. Now the fourth question that we have here is, how does React handle routing and what libraries would you use? So as you all know, basically whenever we start a new project of React, it does not explicitly provides us the routing solution. We have to install React router. तो यहाँ पे भी वही लिखा हुआ है कि React does not have built-in routing capabilities. Instead, the React ecosystem relies on libraries like React Router, which is the most popular library that we use for routing. React Router provides components like browser router, switch, link, etc., navlink to create a navigation structure in single page applications, जिसकी वजह से हमारा पेज reload नहीं होता है. Now this is a simple working of React Router. कि React Router works by rendering components conditionally based on the URL path. It uses the history API that browser provides, ठीक है, and it does not reload the page entirely. Cool. Now to answer this question during an interview, pause the video, understand this. Now next up we have the fifth question, which is explain the concept of lifting up the state and when would you use it. तो अब lifting up state क्या होता है? जब भी आपके पास दो या उससे ज्यादा components हैं and you want to share some particular data from the parent component to all those components, that is when you lift up the state and keep it in the parent component and pass it through props to all the child components. That is lifting up the state. तो यहाँ पे भी वही लिखा हुआ है. Lifting up a state is a pattern where the state that needs to be shared between components is moved to their closest common ancestor. This creates a single source of truth for that data, allowing multiple components to stay in sync. तो दूसरा पॉइंट यह है कि जब भी वो स्टेट री-रेंडर होगी, all of these components will re-render. This means all of them are in sync. You also lift up the state when the child components need to communicate with each other and they use a particular state to communicate. So here is an example. If you have two components that need to work with the same data, like a form or a preview component, instead of duplicating the same state into multiple components, you just lift up the state to the parent component and share it among the children. Now, let's move on to the next question, which is what are controlled and uncontrolled components in React? So, you might have already used this a lot of times. Controlled components are basically when you have an input state. Let's say you have an input component और उसमें आपको state pass करनी होती है. So, basically input component has two major things that you usually use. One is the value attribute and the next one is the onChange handler, right? So you basically create a state और उस state में set state को आप directly onChange में pass कर देते हो and then value को state variable को दे देते हो, right? So this is basically a control component where you are controlling the data or the value that is set to the input component value. So this is basically a control component where you are controlling the value that needs to be set to the input element. Now uncontrolled components on the other hand, we can take the same example. Let's say in this case we create a ref and add that ref to the input element, and using that ref we get the value of the input element but we do not change it. Actually the DOM only changes. So you use that ref to get the data but the value change happens by the DOM itself. Cool. Now to answer this question during an interview, pause the video, understand this. Now the next question is, how would you optimize performance in a React application? There are a lot of ways by which you can optimize React application performance. Use memo, react.memo. Let's see them one by one. So using react.memo for functional components, using use callbacks to memoize function so that they do not re-execute after every render. Using use memo to memoize expensive calculations, implementing virtualization for long list, using libraries like React Window, React Virtualized. So virtualization, it is a different topic in itself, but basically for you to understand, it is something like instead of re-rendering the whole, so let's say I have a list of 100 elements, right? 100 cards, let's say. Now, at a particular point of time, there will only be, let's say, 5 cards that are visible, and rest of the cards are not visible at all. So why should we render the rest of the cards? Instead, we should only render those 5 cards, and the above and the below cards should not be visible, should not be rendered even. That is what virtualization means. Now the next is code splitting using React.lazy and suspense, and then you use Chrome DevTools to optimize and to check how the performance of your website is. Now let's move on to the next question, which is context API and when should you use it. So context API is nothing but a very simplified version of Redux or any state management. You basically use context API for handling themes, for user authentication, etc. Now let's say you have a very simple application and instead of prop drilling, you can take up the state of your entire application and put it into a context, and then you can access it from anywhere throughout your application. Here we are saying how typically we use context API using use context hook and a provider that we wrap our application with, and wherever you use context, the components are subscribed to the changes in the state. Now, when would you use context API? So when you have the data that can be considered global for a tree of components. You want to avoid prop drilling, as we already talked about. The data doesn't change frequently when the data does not change frequently. Now, you might choose a state management library like Redux, MobX, or Justland when you need more advanced features like middlewares or complex state transitions. So as we already mentioned, that context API is for simpler features or simpler functions or simpler React applications. ठीक है. इसके अलावा your application state is highly complex with interdependencies and you need very optimized re-rendering for performance critical applications. This is where you use proper state management libraries. Now, these are few of the points that you should consider telling the interviewer when you are giving the interview and ask the question about context API. Pause the video and understand this clearly. Now, the next question is, what are React hooks and what problems do they solve? तो React hooks कुछ भी नहीं है, एक तरीका है जिससे आप कंपोनेंट की लाइफ साइकिल को हुक कर सकते हो, उसको पकड़ सकते हो, किसी भी उसके एक फेज को पकड़ सकते हो, and based on the hook that you are using, you can leverage the properties of that hook and that particular phase of your component life cycle. ठीक है. सिंपली इसका मतलब ये है कि अगर मेरा कंपोनेंट रेंडर हुआ, मैं यूज इफेक्ट में एम्प्टी डिपेंडेंसी एरे डाल दूंगा, तो वो माउंटिंग के टाइम पे चलेगा. दैट इज व्हाट आई मीन बाय लेवरेजिंग दीज हुक्स वी कैन एक्सेस डिफरेंट phases of a component life cycle. ठीक है. Hooks solve several problems. They eliminate the need for class components, providing a more concise way to use React features. They allow for better organization of logic by grouping related code together instead of splitting the code across lifecycle methods. They make it easier to reuse stateful logic between components through custom hooks. ये बहुत बड़ी चीज़ है, आप custom hooks बना सकते हो using the pre-existing hooks provided by React. They avoid confusion of this keyword binding in class components और bugs को reduce करते हैं basically. ठीक. Now last question. How would you handle side effects in React? First of all, let us understand what side effects are. तो कुछ भी रेंडरिंग हो रही है, ठीक है, या एपीआई कॉल हो रही है, डेटा फेचिंग हो रही है, उसके बेसिस पे आपके रिएक्ट एप्लीकेशन इज बिहेविंग समहाउ डिफरेंटली द वे यू वांट इट टू बिहेव. वो सारे साइड इफेक्ट्स हैं. ठीक है. साइड इफेक्ट्स इन रिएक्ट इंक्लूड डेटा फेचिंग, सब्सक्रिप्शंस, मैनुअल डॉम मैनिपुलेशंस, लॉगिंग एक्सेट्रा. Essentially anything that affects something outside the component scope. अब प्राइमरी वे इसको हैंडल करने का यूज इफेक्ट को ध्यान से यूज करो. अब क्लीन अप फंक्शंस लिखो ताकि जो भी आपका डेटा लीकेज हो रहा है वो सब हैंडल हो सके. कॉमन पैटर्न्स क्या है टू हैंडल साइड इफेक्ट्स? डेटा फेचिंग, यूज इफेक्ट विद एसिंग अवेट और प्रोमिसेस. सब्सक्रिप्शंस, setting up use effect and cleaning up in the return function. Timers, creating in use effect and cleaning up in cleanup function. That is what we already talked about. ठीक है. Pause the video and understand this paragraph clearly, how you should answer this during an interview. Cool. Now do remember that it's not about if you know all the answers or not. It's about how you articulate things, how you are approaching the question during an interview. That's what matters. क्योंकि कई बार ऐसा होता है कि आप सही आंसर नहीं दिया आपने, एंड में आप वहाँ तक नहीं पहुँचे. These are typically very theoretical questions, but जो मशीन कोडिंग राउंड है उसमें अगर आपका अप्रोच सही है तो यू ऑफन क्लियर द इंटरव्यू. ठीक है. तो स्लोली एंड स्लोली आई विल क्रिएट मोर वीडियोज ऑन दीज टॉपिक्स, मशीन कोडिंग राउंड एज वेल. और तब तक के लिए अगर ये हेल्पफुल लगा तो डू लाइक, शेयर एंड कमेंट एंड लेट मी नो आगे कौन कौन से टॉपिक्स मुझे कवर करने चाहिए. व्हाट ऑल डू यू वांट मी टू क्रिएट? दैट्स इट फॉर दिस वीडियो. कीप कोडिंग. बाय बाय.